Alright, so this video is one of the first videos talking about the director. And in this video, we're going to talk about the history. Like, how did this position come to be? So, first of all, we just have to keep in mind that the independent director is one of the newest roles in theater. The independent director didn't really emerge until the 19th century, and that this role emerged because of the rise of realism. With realism, the director became a collaborative artist because we needed this outside eye to be able to make sure that we were, and really a unifying vision to make sure that society was being reflected back on itself in a cohesive way, that those themes were kind of in line with each other and stuff. And that's difficult to do from the inside. It's really, you need that outside eye to do that. And then, when we start to have anti-realism, the director really becomes the creative visionary who is fully responsible for that aesthetic cohesion. And so when we talk about aesthetics, we're really like, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What's the entire vibe? And we want to make sure that it is creatively cohesive. And that's what the director does, and that's what the director evolved into. Currently, theater is considered the director's theater because the role has expanded dramatically. Right now, the director really is the driving force behind the interpretation of the script, the choice as to whether it is historically accurate or not, how historically accurate, like all of these decisions really live within the role of the director. And I am going to give you a link. I'd like you to look at Ivo van Hove. One of the things that is happening is right now, directors have the potential to become even more famous than the performers that are in their shows. And Ivo van Hove is an example of this. So I'm going to give you a link to learn a little bit more about him, because he's doing some pretty rad stuff right now. So before we have the director's theater, we have teacher directors. And so teacher directors really passed along these correct performance techniques within a given style. So the director isn't crafting the style, the director is simply reinforcing this style that already existed. So they're not imposing a personal interpretation. The interpretation is there. So they're not a separate independent role from the creative team. In fact, the playwright was often the official director. Now, the goal in 18th and early 19th century was accurate historical representation. So if the playwright is no longer alive, it is still important to accurately represent things in a way that is historical and true to what was originally intended. And this is coming out of this idea of natural philosophy, which evolved into science, and this interest in empirical research. So these two things are gaining a lot of value in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And the advances in science are never completely separate from the progress and evolution of the creative fields. And so we're reacting. These value systems are reacting to each other. And theater reacts to this interest by really pushing towards rationalism and historical accuracy and research, really to give it a level of consistency. So if there was a revival of something that had been written a long time ago, the playwright is dead, it required research, organization, and comprehensive coordination. So really, the teacher directors, they're fact-checking. They're making sure it's right. They're researchers and stuff like that. This is looking at costumes, this is looking at sets, this is looking at physical mannerisms and stylization. All of these things. If we did give credit to a director, a lot of times that credit would actually just go to a famous actor who was within the troupe, not the person who actually created the cohesive aesthetic. So after we get out of teacher director, we start to move into directors of realism. And this is really how the modern director started to evolve. So it begins at the end of the 19th century, and it starts to be historical accuracy is no longer enough. People are starting to want to see realistic human behavior, as we're going to learn in a later section. Prior to this, we have a lot of wit, we have a lot of royalty being represented, but they're not really looking at real life, and they're really not looking at the common man. But when we get into realism, there is an effort to look at the common man. And so in the 1890s, being a director came to mean a person who would rehearse and organize the entire company towards a complexly and comprehensively fashioned theater presentation. So the director is charged with making sure that complexity and the comprehension is there. And realism wasn't just a theater movement, it wasn't just an art movement. Realism was a political movement. Prior to this, art, there was a goal for it to be pretty and symmetrical and stuff like that. And so it kind of beautified what might have been reality. In this movement of realism, it's really, let's see it how it is. Let's cut the shit, right? Cut the bullshit, and let's look at what's really going on, and let's reflect it back to us. The pretty parts, the ugly parts, all of that. And this is when directing starts to be considered its own art. So we've got some pioneers, and you just need to know the names, right? So we've got George II. He led a German ensemble theater troupe known for acting naturally and individually. We have André Antillon, and he led the realism movement in Paris, Théâtre Libre, and Konstantin Stanislavski. We're going to talk about Stanislavski again. We've already talked about him with acting. Stanislavski made huge strides in theater, and he's actually considered to be one of the, to have created one of the international models of realism. But Stanislavski and Antillon sought to make theater a powerful social instrument for the expression of truth. This is where theater really starts. How can we represent what is true? Now, there is a reaction. So thesis, antithesis. There is a reaction to realism, and that is called anti-realism. Really creative name, I know. So we spend a number of years, about a century, exploring and developing realism, and then we get into the 20th century, and anti-realism rises to fame. And we're going to learn a lot about this, the Dadaists and the Surrealists and stuff like that. But the deal with anti-realism is because this work is going into abstractions. It's starting to get much more abstract. You start to need to have an outside eye to really make sure something is cohesive, at least to make sure the emotional journey is cohesive, or the look of it is cohesive. You really need somebody to lead that vision, because when you throw out realism, anti-realism can be anything that's not realistic, right? So it kind of throws everything out and goes, make it surreal, make it something else. And so you need the director to lead that. A lot of times anti-realism is reactionary. So Paul Fort launched Théâtre d'Art in Paris in 1890 in direct reaction to Antillon. And Meyerhold, who I got to study in grad school, I think he's pretty rad. Meyerhold was a student of Stanislavski. And he responded to Stanislavski's work saying, no, this is my style. And he countered with biomechanical constructivism. And this is super interesting. It's remarkably stylized. It's similar to dance. It's hyper athletic, verging on acrobatics, but it's really looking at these like mechanical gestures, that mean very specific things, and really canonizing and decoding the human physicality and shapes that we can make. But with a focus on physicality, not on emotional truth, which is a really interesting reaction. So These styles introduce new elements to the director's role. So now the director isn't just driving whether this is realistic. They're not just trying to make it complex but real. Now, since we're reacting against realism, since it can be anything but real, what are the things that bring it together? So we can look at lyricism. We can look at symbolism. So what does this represent? Does the bowl represent a bowl, or does it represent the cup of life or the ocean of the world? Like, what does the symbolism mean? Expressive and abstract use of design. How abstract are we going? What are the boundaries? What are the rules? So the director starts to become the person who decides the rules for the piece. And also directing the intentionally contrived methods of acting. So even though we're looking at anti-realism, in order for it to feel cohesive, there have to be rules for a piece. There has to be a style. And so the director becomes the person to actually craft that style. And when the director is leading this kind of creativity, it means that the artistic staff is going to rise to prominence as well. So the set designer, the costume designer, the props designer, all of those things. Edward Gordon Craig, and he is a famous designer and theorist, made this comparison. So he compared the director of a play to the captain of a ship. So this indispensable leader whose rule, maintained by strict discipline, extends over every facet of the enterprise. The point, the thing that matters most, is the director's vision. So this is super different from teacher-director, right? There have been some massive changes. So now when we look at the contemporary director, this is kind of the journey that this has come out of. We've come from teacher-director, where the director just kind of did the research and made sure everybody followed the rules. And then we've got realism, where we're starting to really layer in the complexity of society. So we're making political commentary, but it has to be as real as possible. Then we go into anti-realism. So the director is not just making sure it's real, but making sure that stylistically that there is a stylistic cohesion, because it can be anything but real, right? And so then we get into contemporary director. And the truth is, now we can do any of these things that have existed before. So directing right now is the art of synthesizing script, design, and performance into a unique and splendid theatrical event. Today's director, you have to understand realism and anti-realism. And we have the freedom to mix the two, which is really exciting to watch when we kind of bridge realism and anti-realism. If you ever are watching a show and there's like a flashback or a dream sequence or any of the, I mean, that is mixing realism and anti-realism. I mean, how often in real life, or even we're looking at musicals, people break into song. That's not considered anti-realism. We'll learn about that later. But there is this element, right, that's not fully realistic. So a director can mix the two. The theater of today allows for varieties of historical and artistic combinations. So it doesn't have to be completely historically accurate. We can choose elements that are historically accurate. We can combine them with like a modern paradigm. All of these opportunities. And then when you're looking at devising, and some of the director videos that you have the opportunity to watch, you can hear from a director who is a devising director. The end result actually occurs in the diminishment of the director's sole authority. So devising, you're actually creating the script and the blocking through improvisation and play. So the actors actually improvise and they play together, and then slowly but surely different elements are discovered and celebrated and explored and set. But that means that the director is not the only decision maker in the room. It can be deeply collaborative. So that is what's happening with contemporary directors today, and this is how the history of the director has evolved.